That's a good time to talk about a question that was raised in the last class. What's the point? What is the point? What is the point of this whole enterprise? You should always ask this question. At the end of these two chapters, Ingold asks a different question to us, talking about we all stare into screens all day long and we only encounter ourselves and not others. And he says, is it a world we really want? I'm as guilty as anyone. And I don't know if I'm okay with this world. I've done all right. If we think about the world and the trajectory that we seem to be on, is it a world we really want? I think for most of us, the answer is, I don't know about the world trajectory that we're on. And for me, this is also a question about how to teach anthropology and this whole idea of the history of anthropological thought, which frankly, for the most part in most anthropology courses is actually taught like what Ingold will describe as a depositional approach to knowledge, where you just throw each book on top of the next, and then you dig back through them. And in the history of anthropological thought, you start with the oldest and you work your way up to the youngest. At every point, clearing out the last thing and inventing a whole bunch of new words to go along and without much thought for what is this all for? Somebody said, well, are you happy with your career as an anthropologist? I've been lucky. I've been happy. I'm a person who gets to just talk to people and think about things. To be able to just think about things for a living, that's crazy. To say that I would be unhappy with that would be like so complainy. That would be serious complaining. You'd be like, what's wrong with you? Why are you being so weird? And so no, I am happy. I'm happy with all of that. But at the same time, this is my second go round where I have to deal with the fact that the things that I value and anthropology values in the world, all the values that anthropology has have been are being completely subverted at the highest levels of our society. The value placed on diversity, on migration, on culture. And this is the second time for me that we have someone in office who has now declared English as our official language of the United States, but does not seem to know how to spell, write, or speak in this official language in any sense correctly. And it totally undermines my whole enterprise because we're supposed to be about the valuing of education to see all the people who are frankly uneducated rising to the top of our society. So it's a bummer because the way we've been doing anthropology does not seem to be working. And it wasn't just me. Obviously, I don't have much influence in this, but this is 100 years of anthropology. And where did we get to? We have the language thing. That's a good place to start. For 100 years, anthropologists have been trying to get us to value other languages. Value linguistic diversity. We have a whole field called linguistic anthropology that is all about understanding the intricacies and wonder of human languages. And where has that gotten us? English shall be our language. Is that the world we really want? So for me, teaching this is to try and just shake us up a little bit and to try and imagine a different way of thinking about the world. Does that always work? I don't know. But I'm hoping it will create in us a different way of thinking up the world, imagining the world to be. Maybe it's just a subtle change, but the way we've been doing things just is not working. In part one of this course, I consider it to be now that that's where we did our sensory tune-up. We went into a sensory bath, a detox, you might say, of the ways we usually think about the world and tried to get ourselves to look at the place of humanity in the world differently, to look at animals differently, to think that dragons might be real, dreams, to think about light, sound, how people experience that. I'll make the case that we tuned up our senses. Or if we go back, we think, oh, I could have tuned up my senses. In this part of the class, in part two, I am going to say that the main point of this is actually about how we analyze that experience of being in the field and how we try to understand and interpret the actions and the senses that we came up with. So if you remember, we went back to cellos and lassos, the importance of movement and making continuous adjustment as we go along to the circumstances. Yes, writing must be adjusted as we go along. And actually, that's good because in our part three, we'll be talking about making things like baskets and how you have to adjust as you go along because they're going to be bringing in those palm fronds. Yes, the cello will come back too. Nobody wants to talk about cello. Those are too hard to play. But we do have some guitarists here. We can go with guitar instead. The way we appreciate art, I was trying to come up with a better way to think about this. Art is the very sense, whenever you use the term art, it gives us this sense that tripped us up a little bit that we have to go to a museum and look at things. Whereas we talked about how this is appreciating or how we make judgments, also in motion, and how we adjust our judgments as we go along. Of course, dwelling in the conical lodge. And then in the last class, I'll just say that we talked about sailing and all the lessons that we can learn from being mariners in the world of water, in the water world, on a raft somewhere. Seemed pretty cool to me. So this class too, I'm going to say that this is in part about how we analyze things. What do we traditionally value in an analysis? What do you want to see the professor write on your paper when you get it back? What kinds of words do you want to have used about you? Do you want to be a shallow person? No, you don't want to be shallow. What do you want to be? Exactly. You want to be deep. We value depth. We want to be a deep thinker, an in-depth thinker. We value people who go to the core of things. We don't want to just stay on the surface. We want to peel off the layers of things and get to the core. And we want to get down there. We value people who get to the fundamentals of things. We don't want to be all superficial on the surface. We want to get to the fundamentals. And oftentimes this comes with a masculinist, gendered idea that what we really want to have is a penetrating analysis, a seminal approach to, you're going to have this penetrating insight, which is, yeah, you might not want that. So these are things that traditionally we value when we're doing analysis. We would like to hear these things told to us. We don't want to be shallow. That's not how you're supposed to be. This trouble with schools is, and I've been kicked out of enough of them to know, if it's less painless for the brainless. So, but that is not what you want to be. The problem with this schools, you're supposed to become an in-depth person. You're supposed to become that person. You're supposed to be in depth. You're supposed to know all these things. This approach, in some ways, was in anthropology most distilled by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who probably became the second most famous anthropologist in the United States, I would say. So you had Margaret Mead, who was very, very famous for a long time, but Margaret Mead was a popularizer anthropologist. She liked to be everywhere. She used to want to be a very best-selling anthropologist, and she was. She wrote for things like Red Book and gave advice to people and things like that. Geertz comes onto the scene with The Interpretation of Cultures, published in 1973, and he becomes more of an anthropologist famous within academic circles. So if you went over, still to this day, if you go over to, say, the literature people or the people who were studying texts, they would talk about, oh yeah, Clifford Geertz, very famous anthropologist. And his most famous collection of essays was this idea of the interpretation of cultures. And I wanted to bring Geertz up because he does have this idea of doing a deep reading of things. So I asked I asked Google, what is Gertz's most famous idea? And indeed, it shot me back exactly what Clifford Gertz's most famous idea is. I completely agree with this overview. It's thick description. This is what he pronounced in this interpretation of culture, so that you would keep understanding the deeper meaning and symbols of these cultural practices. So you would do your observations, but you would penetrate beyond the layers of this. And then I said, well, I was thinking about this because I asked, well, then what's his most famous essay? And I totally agree with this too. His most famous essay is Deep Play, Notes on the Balinese Cockfight. So he's talking about, this essay begins with this wonderful scene where he's at a cockfight in Bali and it gets overturned by the police. And so he's running away. And he says that that's how he got in with his anthropological informants at last, as they were all running from the police when they were busting up the Balinese cockfight. But he wrote about this. The idea is that this game, the play of the cockfight, was nevertheless a microcosm or a deep way of thinking about Balinese society. And so Gertz's work on this would become a template for how people did anthropology, how people did history, and as Ingold tells us, how people do literature as well. This idea that you want to be an in-depth thinker, that you want to do close readings of things. And so in some ways, across various disciplines, this has became the standard since the 1970s, that you would do a close reading of the text. And anthropology, it became an idea that the anthropologist was simply a reader of texts in which the text was another culture or another society. And it's crystallized in Gertz. And in some ways, this probably also applies to what happened in archaeology as well. In this chapter, in this first chapter, he talks quite a bit about archaeology and that it shares with other disciplines like history and in some cases anthropology, this idea of a depositional approach to the past, where the past is simply, let's say in history, is an archive waiting to be uncovered, and that it's just a stack of things. The oldest is on the bottom and the newest is on the top, and then you go through it. By the way, traditionally speaking, 100 years ago or say, what was the biggest attraction of archaeology? Pyramids. Now you're getting somewhere. Egypt. Napoleon. Digging stuff in, being able to go out there and find some treasures, being able to dig things. Isn't that the real appeal of archaeology? There's this renewed attention to surfaces. So instead of thinking just about depth and getting down to the core of things, people have been thinking about surfaces. And then he cites a lot of people who've been thinking about surfaces. I found a few of these covers. There you go. Surfaces, a history. Surfaces, transformations of body, materials, and earth. Or, oh no, this is a weird cover. Surface tension. But the point of the matter is that people have been, as Ingold says, they've been, instead of this idea that we have to go in depth and be an in-depth person, people have actually turned their attention back to surfaces. I would say that even in archaeology, what do the archaeologists do now? I would say that the archaeologists, I'm just going to venture a guess, that most archaeologists dig less than they have ever dug in the past. Part of it is the recognition that when you dig something up, you're destroying the site. And so you have to be very careful about doing that because you assume that somebody else might be able to do it later better. But also the idea of doing a survey, whether that be walking through a terrain or a plane overhead, has actually become maybe at least or more important than the actual excavation process itself, which is when you want to find out a lot about a very small area. But you can get a lot from the survey part of things. At least that's what the BBC tells me in this picture, which is about LiDAR and how they get the whole tracks of the land and the layout of things. And you can get a lot of information just by taking a picture well, a cool picture or a radar or a laser picture from the surface. And so this, they say, well, if you think archaeologists spend all the time with trowel in hand in a muddy ditch, then it's time to think again. So in this chapter, Ingold wants to extend our understanding of surfaces or participate in this by looking at two surfaces that we know every day: the ground and the page and the ground. So these are things that we either are walking on or turning, or things that we know very well. What he says here is that if you went into medieval times, they would totally recognize this, the ground and the page, as a very similar activity. And so that's the point of this riddle, is that the plow is like the quill pen, which is actually a feather, inscribing on the page the way a plow person would inscribe onto the earth. And I thought this was interesting for several reasons. So if he tells us that the origin of these words actually gives the game away, that we get page from the Latin pagus, which actually means a field. And in that field would be the peasants plowing the earth. And yes, I was smiling because I too was so happy to see that in this case, the peasants are just all right. They're not battling the earth and losing. Those peasants are doing the right thing. They're inscribing the earth. They're doing their peasant thing. He also notes here, I just thought that this was that in the riddle of the monk, that the analogy is from ground to page, because in the old days, everybody knew how to plow, but very few people knew how to write. These days, everybody learns to read and write, but nobody learns how to plow. We barely drive, but we should learn how to plow. We should learn both those things. So the page comes from pagus, and write comes from the old Saxon, or old Saxon, ritan, which actually didn't mean right in this. It does mean right in our sense, but it meant to scratch or to tear or to score something. And so actually anything that tore or scratched the land, the tracks of an animal, for example, could be considered a form of writing. And that we get the word book from Old English bok, the mighty oak, and its relative, the beech. And so you actually have the idea of the tree. The tree is the book. The pages are like leaves that you turn. And the meaning of read, to read meant really to listen to others. So it wasn't necessarily that you were reading a book. You could be reading the land. You could be reading the tracks in the land. You could be reading, just listening to the wisdom that others give you. And so, in fact, there was this complete analogy, or it was very analogous. It was very similar to think about writing as a form of plowing land. Earth writing is just two words that are both very familiar to us, the earth and writing. And he's just trying to draw attention to that these would have been very corollary back in the old days with those peasants scribing things along. I agree with you, though, some terms can be annoying. I didn't find earth writing annoying. It's just goofy. So, or you could have objected to palimpsest, but this is a great word. You can't ever object to palimpsest because it's a wonderful word, and you should always use it at least once a day. But palimpsest in this sense is that apparently once they got rid of writing on trees and stuff, they used those animal hides. And so you'd be scraping away the last thing somebody wrote and then writing something else on it. And it leads to this idea that there's multiple layers in the writing itself, and in some ways quite literally, where you'd have a Greek text and you'd scrape that away, but you could still see the Greek and write a bunch of stuff in Latin on top until eventually you can't use it anymore. So that's where we get the palimpsest from. Now, the thing is that Ingold says that actually The palimpsest is this image that has been taken up by many archaeologists. Apparently, if you read some archaeological books like Gavin Lucas's The Archaeological Record, he talks about the archaeology itself as dealing with a palimpsest because you're dealing with these layers upon layers of stuff that has been into the earth. So on the one hand, you have these super clean people who sweep the floor away every day and then start their lives as we should. We clean up things and then start our lives again. And if you're an archaeologist, if you find the super clean people, there's not going to be much to have there because they've been cleaning up the floor every day and it's gone. So you might only find the broom. Whereas the archaeologists would really love it. What would they love to find? Messy people. Well, not just messy in a particular way. Those people that throw everything out and just put it on a heap and start living up. That would be great. And so if you were an archaeologist, you want the messy people because they just throw everything away and just build it up and then you can just dig down layer by layer. Yes, this would be fun archaeology. But the archaeologists say that most sites are somewhere between these two extremes. Most people are neither super clean nor are they super dirty. And so you have to interpret this as a palimpsest. At that point, Ingold objects to all these archaeologists. He says, wait a second, that's not the way things are, though, actually. There is those people who make rock art and they have to wear things away and scratch it to make new art on top of the art. But unless you're doing that, it doesn't apply. And so you archaeologists, you should not talk about the world as a palimpsest. That applies certain things. He says that the thing, when you're cleaning up things, you're sweeping it away, but then you're left with the surface. It's not like scraping a hide. It's not a true palimpsest, says Ingold. And he says that Lucas must be thinking of a chalkboard where sometimes there's writing there, but you can scratch over it. So somehow from there, we get into, well, it applies to the notion of the rock art, or when you're working on a surface, you're sometimes trying to scrape it away to come up with new things. And Ingold says this is like the word wear, which has two meanings. One, you can wear clothes, which is like putting something on to your body. We all know about that. But also, things can be worn away. That's what the rain does. There it is, the same word with two apparently contradictory meanings. Wearing clothes and wearing away. It's a deal, Lev. The sculptors wouldn't have known that this actually is not the way things are. What are they sculpting? The cloth. There it is. These are sculptures with a veil covering. But in order to make this how do you make this sculpture? You're not able to sculpt clothing onto a person. You have to just sculpt it, scrape it until you reveal the clothing. And so Ingold says there's no naked person under there to titillate you because that is the sculpture itself. That's part of what he's trying to say in this chapter is let's look at what people actually say and think and not pretend that we have the in-depth answer that you don't because I've been able to read your culture better than you yourself. That's exactly what he's criticizing, is this arrogant idea that we have all the answers and that we're going to go in and get somebody's culture out of them and take it somewhere else. I mean, yeah, I would say that you're totally agreeing with Ingold again. The veil covers, but does not cover up. It is a revelation, not a disguise. This is a great quote. Imagined as a veil, the ground does not hide the earth's depth beneath its surface, but allows us to feel the depth in its surface. So that would be great. Now, the problem is all that has changed now. Because now we don't feel the ground anymore. What do we feel? The highway. It's all been paved. It's all been paved. And so the ground has been paved, and we talked about that. And for the last two classes, we've been talking about paving, but for now, we'll talk about printing. The page and the ground are now the same, but they've both been transformed. So in the old days, the medieval times, the page and the ground had a corollary because both were inscribed upon or plowed or written upon. But today they are the same, but they've both been transformed because of the paving and the printing. So in the old days, we had to run our finger along the lines, and in fact, words weren't even, there weren't spaces between words, so it was actually difficult to tell where one word began and one ended, and so you had to run your finger along the lines and often read it out loud, and that would be the way you read. You would not read silently. You would not read without your finger. And so you quoted this part: the reader of the printed work, in short, no longer inhabits the page as a walker inhabits the terrain betwixt sky and earth, making their way by finger rather than foot. And so Ingold is complaining, yes, about the printing and how it separates us from the manuscript when we don't get to inhabit it anymore, which does change the art of being able to write and the calligraphy aspect of things. In schools now, people don't learn how to write cursive anymore. So most people that write in printed letters, and so the ability to write and read in cursive has gone away. Yeah, he says that the printing itself is actually a craft, and this pressing of things and surfaces, and that is actually an art as well. And so he says he was wrong to say that printed work just eliminates the line. He wants to revisit that a little bit. He says that that does bring back this skill, a certain magic about the way ink takes to paper, but it gets hidden, that you don't get to see it. The printmaker, it just happens, and then you have to open it up. So, certain magic about the way ink takes to paper. So Ingold is trying to say that not all is lost with print. And he also makes the point that in the olden days, you actually manually cut the pages of a book and then stitch them together. Pages have to be cut. And so Ingold is saying that the print creates a new kind of world, concentrating on the words and their meanings, where we are inclined to forget how central the act of page turning is to reading. And here we have pages. It's not just a jewelry box, because a jewelry box you can just grab in and grab out all those jewels, but for a book you have to turn the pages. If you want to steal something out of the book, you'd have to rip a page out of it. So it is different from a jewelry box, because you have to turn the page. Every turn is a moment of profound revelation, affording not an end, but a new beginning. Others have been complaining that Ingold is having all these revelations, and here he pushes it to the extreme, where every time you turn a page, imagine being able to read a book that way, getting excited every time you turn a page and you're on a new beginning. So you chose the wrong chapter, because you should have chosen the more pages. The more pages you have, the more opportunity to have a new beginning every time you turn that page. Mind blown. The next sentence was just, ew. So maybe he was thinking about those statues in a weird way. You do have to wonder.
This is the cello.
This and the cello. That's, yeah. We'll just leave that be. Again, in the olden days, the textile, the screen was actually a textile or a weave, and that gives us the word for text as well. And that did have, still in the book, you have this very haptic sensation. This chapter does have a lot of connections back to the conical lodge, which is that when you go with the screen, you get into this optical thing, and things are more about optics and projection. And so, in a similar way, in the olden days, it was very rare that you would ever see your own face. In most of human history, people didn't see their own faces very often. You saw other people's faces, and they might be looking at you, but you would never see your own face. Now, the first thing that transforms that is, of course, mirrors. And now we can just look in the mirror and see our own face all the time. We don't have to look at ourselves in the eyes of others. And we talked about this with the selfies. I think it is more than ever in human history, we end up staring at our own selves all the time. And so Ingold is talking about these screens, yet here I am, writing these lines on a laptop computer to my regret and by force of circumstances, knowing that I would rather be putting pen to paper. Sure, Ingold, but then somebody else has to type it up for you. Who's going to do that, I ask. Staring at what everyone tells me is a screen. So this reached unprecedented levels. Do you remember when we all went on Zoom during COVID? In the COVID days, it was weird because at first everybody was supposed to appear on the screen, but then everybody turned their cameras off. And so it's just me looking at myself teaching to boxes that aren't on anymore. And I will also say that my family, we do a weekly Zoom that started during COVID, but because we live far apart from each other, it keeps going. It's very nice to see your family every week, but it's also weird to stare at yourself talking to your family for an hour. Every so often you feel like words don't make sense anymore and you've been disembodied from yourself. So, yeah. He also complains that he is using this thing called Windows, and I do wonder if he'd be better off on a Mac. So, at the very end, is this the world we really want? I'm confused about this, and I don't think we want to be staring only at ourselves through screens all the time. Another question which comes up at the end of the last chapter, are our minds more like a palimpsest or a depositional archive? But we've shifted from the idea that the mind is like this, that the idea of reading is actually to aid our memory, to the idea of being able to write things down is to get them out of our heads and put them away so we don't have to remember them. Once we write it down, it's gone. Ingold suggests a couple of things that we could do. We could read this book called We Are Going on a Bear Hunt, and that would be a form of earth writing because there they are going through all this landscape and sloshing along and squelching through the mud. That's one thing that you could do. But more importantly is that we could engage in what he calls wayfaring. So the way that we tend to travel these days, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone, is we connect 2 points and we want to get from here to there. And we now do it by plugging it into some device, which then tells us how to get from here to there. And so what Ingold recommends is a process of wayfaring, which is not necessarily to try and connect 2 points together, but at every movement to keep on going. And so to be a form of becoming rather than a way a way of continuing to become human as you go along, not a sense of arrival or departure. So that is my recommendation for you, wayfaring.